Hi, everybody. I just want to start off by saying that it's really a huge pleasure to be here, and that I feel very grateful to have been invited to come to this conference, to have a chance to speak with you and to connect with you. There are a huge number of people in this room who I have learned a lot from and find really deeply inspiring. And I think of us as being part of, I think, an extended tribe looking to make the world a better place in a lot of different ways and in a lot of different places. And so it's really exciting to be here. Before I start, before I get into things, I want to, well, actually, I should just introduce myself a little bit more. So I work with an organization called Leadnow.ca, and over the last, thank you. Over the last 2 years, we've grown to include about 225,000 Canadians working together to strengthen our democracy, protect our environment, and build a more fair economy. And I think part of what distinguishes us has been our use of, or part of what differentiates us has been our real focus on using technology as a tool to empower people and connect them with one another, and to bridge people into political action and into the political process. And at the core of that has been a real focus on experimentation, on democratic experimentation, on seeing how we can find new ways to bring people together, to connect them with one another, and to have them move from a particular moment of outrage or opposition into a sense of common and collective purpose, and with deep commitment to shared action. So I'm going to tell a couple stories about kind of where we came from. I'm going to talk about some of the things that we've learned that may be of use. I'm going to talk a little bit about this kind of moment in history that we're in right now, in Canada, in our communities, on this planet, and then conclude with some thoughts on where we can go from here as part of a extended tribe of people trying to make the world a better place. Before I get into that, though, what I'd really like is for everybody to take a moment for reflection, for individual reflection. And what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to take a moment to close your eyes, please. This is a bit of an act of trust. I'd like you to take a moment, I'd like you to close your eyes. And I'd like you to spend a couple minutes thinking about what is it that brought you here today? Why are you at this conference and why are you in this room? This is going to go on slightly longer than is normally comfortable. Okay, let's bring it back. Thank you. Okay, so I'll start with just a bit about kind of where I've been coming from and how I got into this work. I started off as a student organizer in the youth climate movement back in 2006, 2007 as a grad student at UVic, and I was working on ecological governance and trying to understand how innovative governance models could bring people together to solve environmental and social problems. And I had a real focus on the campus and on our universities as a particular place to create change. Working at UVic with a professor named Michael McGonigal at the Pulse Project for Ecological Governance. And our focus at that time, it was a very optimistic time in climate activism, if that can ever really be said. But it was a relatively optimistic time in climate activism because at that moment, climate change as an issue was actually the top of mind issue in the country. It actually briefly replaced healthcare as the number one most important issue in the country, and there was an enormous amount of energy for progress on that issue in that time. And you could really see that on campuses all across the country. So our strategy, or the methodology that we used to try to create change, was collaborative planning. We would, as student groups, we would organize planning processes that would bring together students, staff, faculty, and regional partners to talk about how the university could not only reduce its own impact on the environment, reduce its own greenhouse gas emissions, but the term we were using was go beyond climate neutral by harnessing its research, its education capacity, its purchasing power, basically its existence as these small cities, to try to catalyze and drive regional climate change solutions. And the purpose of using collaborative planning was threefold. First, fourfold actually. First, collaborative planning built new relationships between students, staff, faculty, and regional partners and people in the community. New relationships that didn't exist before, but that would be necessary in order for these universities to be able to realize their potential. Second, it developed new ideas through these collaborations, new ideas that wouldn't have been possible if these folks had been trying to contribute in isolation from one another without recognizing how, say, the School of Agricultural Planning could work with the food services folks on campus, and how that could be connected through a business program through a local purchasing strategy. So develop new ideas, and the process of collaborative planning, the process of reaching out to engage people in conversations about how their communities could be part of these solutions, that process built support for those ideas, built support that would be necessary to see them implemented, and actually challenged the legitimacy of more closed, behind closed doors planning processes that were the norm on most university campuses. I would describe this process as having been a partial notable success. So what it accomplished at the time was it led to a series of campus sustainability plans in British Columbia that were better than we would have gotten otherwise, but still imperfect in a lot of different ways. So it was kind of my first foray into this work was through this experience of democratic process as an opportunity to come up with new ideas, as an opportunity to build new relationships, and as an opportunity to build support for the collective action that we need in order to address the kinds of challenges that we're facing in our world and in our society. The more time I spent working at the campus level, the more it became clear that the opposition to progress on climate change, that the barriers to opposition on climate change were coming from the top down. While there was increasing momentum and support from the bottom up in a lot of the places where we were working, there was growing opposition from national governments and growing mobilization by the global fossil fuel industry to block and dismantle any attempts at progress that we were trying to achieve from a bottom-up level. I began organizing with youth across the country as part of the Canadian Youth Climate Coalition, and went to the Copenhagen Climate Conference in 2009 to advocate for real climate solutions and progress that would build a fair and ambitious and binding agreement for the world that would embody a spirit of climate justice, that would take historic responsibility for the role that rich countries have played in causing climate change, and help to bridge us into the kind of practical global coordination that is required to try to address this challenge. Copenhagen was a transformative experience for me. For one thing, I met Charlie there. For another, I saw the stakes of that issue, of the issue of climate change, in a way I'd never seen them before, and I came to understand the consequences of closed and exclusionary processes on our ability to build a better world in a way that I had never really understood them before. I remember at Copenhagen, and Copenhagen was supposed to be, this is 2009, this is a while ago now, but Copenhagen was supposed to be like the conference that was going to save the world. We had really built up in the lead up to this. The global climate movement had really built up the stakes of this conference, and that was the expectation, was that this was the conference where we were going to get the deal that was going to move us forward. And I remember some of my most vivid memories from that conference were of being part of, there were 15,000 people there, a fraction of whom were actually delegates. 15,000 people there, delegates and then civil society, and then huge numbers of folks there from industry, in particular from fossil fuel industries. Everybody kind of competing for space and attention. And I remember early in the first week of that conference, I saw a rally being led by representatives of African delegations and the Small Island states. And at that rally, it was a huge rally. There were hundreds of people there. There were leaders from the global south. It was vibrant, it was powerful, and they were chanting, 2 degrees is suicide, 3 degrees is genocide. And they were in public, in community, and in solidarity. They were speaking to the stakes of this conference and this moment of history for their communities back home. And I remember looking at this and thinking, these are the leaders here. These are the people who are speaking. These are the people who are speaking for a just future. And so the second realization was so where are the people who are getting in the way of this vision that's being described right now? Who are getting in the way of the kind of collective action we need to respond to the alarm bells that these people are ringing so loudly? The answer, in large part, is that they were nowhere to be seen because they were working behind closed doors in secretive processes that people didn't have access to. They were working to dismantle and block any chance for a strong global deal. It wasn't something that many of them would, that the exact machinations of that and what that was looking like were something that they were all trying to avoid responsibility for, public responsibility for. They're all trying to blame each other. But behind closed doors, certain governments in the fossil fuel industry were blocking any meaningful progress on this issue. And I remember one night in particular, with the Canadian youth delegation, I remember watching on TV, there had been a stunt earlier that day. That day where, with a really creative action, a group had made a release that was as though the world's leaders had come to a just agreement on climate change, and like talked about what that would have looked like. And it went totally globally viral. It was spread very broadly through social media. It was really exciting. And it painted a picture, it told a story of this moment in history and what a really positive choice could look like. Later that night, we were, as the Canadian youth delegation, we were all in a dorm. There were 30 of us in this very, very overly packed dorm. We were watching TV and we were ready for Peter Mansbridge to come on and talk about this kind of friendly prank that had happened earlier in the day, and we were all really excited about that and expected it to be the headline because it had just made global news. And instead, what Peter Mansbridge told us was that documents had been leaked which showed that the stated positions of some of the delegates at the conference, the stated positions for what they were coming in with, saying, we'll make these kinds of reductions over this period of time, which in and of themselves weren't good enough to actually prevent catastrophic climate change, that those stated positions were in fact a lie, and that their actual intention was to do far less than that. And so we went collectively from this moment of inspiration around the world that could be to the reality that we were being excluded and shut out of a closed-door process where we were in fact, and additionally being lied to about what the plans of some of the most powerful political leaders on the globe were in this moment, trying to address this moment of crisis and of challenge. And I experienced something in that moment that I'd never experienced before, and I guess thankfully I've never experienced since, which was I've lived in many ways a very privileged life. I experienced a moment of white hot rage, just utter fury, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I had been kicked out of my society. And I recognized that part of what was happening in this moment was that political leadership in the rich countries was that they were breaking the most basic social contract of our democracies, which is always been more of a story to aspire to than always the reality. But the most basic aspect of the social contract, which is that we give up some of our freedom in exchange for basic security. We give authority to government in exchange for most basic security. And instead, as a generation, we were being abandoned by our political leaders in this moment. And I experienced this as this sense of abandonment and this rupturing of the social contract as just anger and distancing from being in this space. And everybody else kind of stayed in the room, but I disappeared from it in my own head. And it took me a few minutes to get back from that. And what happened was the people in the room, the other 29 youth in the room, they took this in stride. Their answer was, okay, well, the answer to this is we need to double down. We need to organize more. We need to work in solidarity with other youth in other countries. We need to mobilize. We need to keep going. And that sense of solidarity, that sense of, in a moment of just utter outrage and abandonment, that sense of solidarity and of being with other people who wanted to work together towards a shared goal, brought me back from this sense of abandonment and this rage, and instead it transmuted those feelings through what I now understand is called emotional alchemy. It transmuted those feelings. Fear went into joy, grief went into gratitude, and despair went into faith. That by working together, we did have a chance in achieving progress on these issues. And in coming back from Copenhagen, in the months after coming back from Copenhagen, I worked with primarily youth youth from the Canadian Youth Climate Movement. We decided to found Leadnow as an organization that had a few goals. Part of it, though, for me has always been an essential part of it for me has been to help make sure that we can build solidarity across movements so that when people feel like, and just contribute to this as one small part, but contribute to building solidarity across movements so that when people are facing these moments of abandonment and attack by their own governments, that they have a sense of being part of something bigger than themselves that'll move forward with them and in action with them. And in a really practical sense, founded Leadnow to use technology as a tool to help people connect across issues, to help connect movements, and to begin to bridge from a more disengaged or non-political space into collective political action. So we launched right before the 2011 federal election, and part of what I was asked to do in the speech was to just give a couple stories about some of the ways in which we've been using technology as a tool to organize democratically and what that's looked like for us. And so I'm just going to go through a couple stories on that note right now. We launched with a campaign called, we launched with a series of events across the country called Regeneration. And the purpose of these events was to bring people together in their communities to talk about what their agenda for the next parliament would look like in 2011. So what would a cross-partisan agenda that would be representative of a majority of Canadians and would work to address some of the critical challenges of our time. What would that agenda look like? What was important to them? We were really surprised when, in putting this call out, we ended up having, I believe it was over 60 local leaders stepped up to host these local house gatherings and conversations across the country. And using email and social media, we then connected other people in those communities who wanted to participate but didn't feel comfortable hosting, connected people in those communities to come out for these events, which were spread out over the course of a week. In these conversations, they talked about their hopes for the country and what the key values that they had and the key pieces of the key action items that they would want to see in a new government. And we, through a process then, we took the ideas from that, found some of the most common themes, and turned that then into an online engagement process, a series of surveys that went back out to the community and went out to a broader broader number of Canadians across the country who weren't able to participate directly in those house gatherings, to ask them of these values and these ideas that have been put forward, what are the most important to you, and to rank and to select and to prioritize that. One of the things that was interesting from doing this is that we found that the people who were engaged, the people who had been engaged online to meet face-to-face, then became people who were driving outreach through social media, through email, through their networks, to engage more people to participate in this process for refining this shared agenda over time. So it wasn't that online and offline were two separate things. It was that online engagement and face-to-face engagement could be woven together over the course of a several-week process, and that people who stepped up to be leaders in one space could be leaders in another space and engaging more people to participate. So that led to the creation of a document which is called the Declaration for Change, which we then encouraged people across the country to pledge to vote for those values. The second thing that happened during the 2011 federal election for us was a group of friends of ours at the University of Guelph organized a vote mob. And we had no idea, they just invented the term vote mob. And it was a flash mob of young people saying, basically, surprise, we're going to vote. And set to music, Florence and the Machine, the dog days are over, and involved spandex and running around. The video went viral that this first group did on Guelph, and they ended up getting 20,000 views or whatnot. And made national media attention, and we realized that this was a model that could be replicated on other campuses to encourage young people not only to see that other young people were voting, but to begin to articulate their vision for the country, to begin to articulate the issues that were really important to them, many of which were encapsulated in this Declaration for Change that had been put together through the regeneration process. So we did three things. We used our existing networks to organize two other vote mobs, one at the University of Victoria, and I think the other one was at the University of I think it was at Carleton. And so now all of a sudden, instead of there just being one vote mob, there was three vote mobs, and there was a website that had a map where you could you could declare that your campus was going to do a vote mob and go to see the other videos, and that was enough to turn vote mobs from a thing that happened on one campus to a national movement, that all of a sudden there were folks that wanted to make sure that they had a vote mob on their own campus, and in the end over 40 campuses signed up to do their own vote mobs, and thousands of young people were engaged in doing this with extremely little central direction or control from us. All we really did was create a platform. And thank you. And I think one of the lessons that we take from that experience It then created, vote mobs then changed the narrative of that election and raised the issue of youth voting in that election, and raised specifically, not just the issue of youth voting treated as a problem, why don't the youth vote, but instead created platforms, distributed platforms for young people to talk about what they wanted to vote for. As the vote mobs progressed, the signs that people were carrying were saying, I'm voting for accessible, affordable education, I'm voting for a clean energy economy. And it created a national media platform to speak to these issues through which was made possible through their distributed leadership. I think that one of the things that we found that the internet makes possible is the internet makes it possible if you create a platform for it. The internet makes it possible for people to self-identify as leaders, to step up and to volunteer in moments, to work together with very low kind of costs of coordinating with one another, and to be able to collectively send powerful messages by doing that. Other moments like the Occupy movement was another real amazing example of that, where a shared message with a voluntary, with a platform that allowed for a lot of voluntary leadership, made it possible for a huge number of people to send a very powerful message without having to do all that much messy work of needing to coordinating with one another. The third experience that we had in that election was we did our first rapid response petition. There was a very weird story that I'm not going to go into in detail because honestly I kind of feel bad for the Conservative staffer involved. This guy Michael Sona. But it involved a kerfuffle around a vote box in Guelph. And that led to Michael kind of being thrown under the bus. But we organized a petition called Hands Off Our Ballots to ensure that those votes would be counted. And over 8,000 people signed that petition within a couple of days, which was our first petition and was much more than we were expecting. And part of what's interesting about that is that 8,000 number, if you think about it, would be larger than the number of people that participated in the vote mobs in raw terms, and larger again than the number of people who participated in regeneration, in those distributed local events. Now, for us, this sequence went from people engaging in a really high-level way in these local gatherings to the vote mobs, which involved dozens of local leaders, but then hundreds of people who were just participating on the day, hundreds, maybe thousands, and then this petition that had 7,000 people on it. So normally with online organizing, it works in the other direction, which is you use, with most online organizing and most online engagement, you meet people where they're at with simple, easy actions that allow them to express something that is important to them in a moment when it's important to them in a way that'll make a difference. Then you ask them to take the next step and to get more involved in their community by potentially going to an action, going to a rally, writing a letter to the editor, or another kind of tool or action along those lines, bridging them to take one more step and go up a ladder of engagement in that way. And then the third and final step is asking people to become volunteer leaders and to become organizers within their own community. We've seen in online organizing around the country and globally that pattern of low barrier to entry, but then high ceiling for what people can end up doing together is a very successful way for engaging as many people as possible to do as much productive action as possible together. And those three pieces, a rapid response online action at a moment, in an outrageous moment, decentralized house gatherings that then lead to talk about what it is that we want to accomplish together, that then lead to an online process that can engage more and more people in setting a common agenda, and distributed actions where lots of local leaders can get together in a coordinated way to send a coordinated message. Those three components have been the primary tools in our organizing toolbox over the last 2 years. And in a moment I'm going to move to conclude by talking about where those three tools go from here and how it relates to broader democratic organizing. But I just want to take a moment to speak to this particular period that we're in right now, this particular period that we're in history as a country and as a broader global society, and how deepening democratic engagement using technology as a tool fits into this moment. So, normally, or I shouldn't say normally necessarily, societies, communities, political communities have a rough, broad consensus that establishes the parameters of political debate. It establishes which ideas are thought of as being crazy and which ideas are thought of as being mainstream, normal, common sense. Consensus doesn't mean that everybody agrees by any means. They can be extremely exclusionary. But it means that the parameters of debate, that at a minimum that thought leaders, but also generally the broader public, are working within, are defined. At the end of World War II, there was the rise of what could be called the post-war consensus, which was that government, labor, and corporations would work in a somewhat collaborative, somewhat combative relationship to build a middle class. That post-war consensus was then attacked by neoliberalism in the 1980s. And the neoliberal attack on the post-war consensus, in particular, attacked the role of government in society as an avenue of collective action. The process, the outcome at this point in the impact of that attack has been not to establish fully a new consensus, but in effect to delegitimize both major institutions in our society, delegitimize both government and reduce trust in government, and delegitimize and reduce trust in corporations and in corporate governance. We're living in a really unusual period in history where broad trust in our institutions is very, very low, both government and corporations in particular. In a moment of broken consensus and low trust, in a moment when most people feel excluded from the decisions that affect their lives, when most people feel like their lives are being shaped and controlled by unseen forces they have very little ability to control. In moments like that, people simultaneously really want their voices to be heard and to be included. They really want to be able to shape their future. And that is something that we saw in the regeneration gatherings and in all of the gatherings that we've held since then, is that when people can gather on their own terms to talk about the issues that are important to them in their communities, they actually experience that as a pleasurable thing. And simultaneously, there's this yearning to be able to participate, this yearning to be able to be part of shaping their futures and their communities together. And at the same time as there's that yearning, as that force is present, there's another force present, which is this a huge focus on yourself and on your self-interest and a sense of profound insecurity in the world, which makes you resistant to change and focused on your own interests in a narrow way. And we're seeing both of these forces at play in our society right now really powerfully. In order to be able to address the massive challenges that are facing our society, in order to be able to address the massive challenges that are facing our society, we have to work on this crisis of declined trust. We have to work on this crisis in order to, and bring people together in order to rebuild social trust, that we can take collective action together, that we can move from a narrow focus on our own self-interest based on a sense of actually rejection and abandonment and exclusion from broader society and decision making, and move towards a sense of being able to work in common purpose towards the common good. Democratic process is not just important in the abstract or as an ideal. it's important as a practice that is transformative of the people who are participating in it. Democratic process is how we can bring people from an initial sense of outrage or opposition to something that's happening that's affecting their lives and bring them into a sense of community and support for positive alternatives. So, moving forward in this work, for Leadnow specifically, we're going to have a twofold focus. On the one hand, running rapid response campaigns and other online actions that help people collectively oppose changes that they are not in favor of and that are acting against their interests. And we've found that that is by far the fastest way to grow a community is in opposition. But then build channels and build democratic processes that engage these people who are lightly engaged in opposition to a shared to something that they can agree is bad. Build democratic processes through face-to-face house gatherings, through online participatory processes that allow this community to begin to build support for a set of common objectives together, in particular in relation to electoral reform, climate justice, and reducing income inequality. I think that shift is interesting to think about in the context of other levels of government, in other kinds of governance situations. In particular, when we're looking at municipalities or provincial governments or governments themselves in general, actually, the process of participatory budgeting may be one of our best avenues for bridging people from concern or outrage over either how their money is being spent or where cuts are being made, begin to bridge people from outrage and opposition and begin to bridge them into support for positive alternatives. And we've seen growing experimentation in participatory budgeting in cities and in countries across the world, most famously in parts of Latin America. In moving towards helping citizens bridge from their opposition to things that they don't like, and to support for things that they're in favor of in common. As part of that shift, that political alchemy towards building a new consensus, there is, I think, a final concept that I just want to really emphasize, which is that we can get stuck when we think of democracy as an abstract principle. We can get stuck when we think of democracy as a good thing that we should all pay lip service to. We can get stuck when we think of democracy as an ideal. It's more useful, it's more productive, and it's more accurate to think of democracy as a set of practices. And like anything else that we can practice, whether it's theater, sports, any other practice, practices are things that we get better at by practicing and by experimenting with. Democracy as practice is a difficult, messy terrain that requires experimentation, refinement, iteration, new applications at different levels of government, new applications in different kinds of institutions, a massive diversity of different and new ways of bringing people together, both using technology and using face-to-face conversations. And in thinking about democracy as a practice, in thinking about democracy as something that we can get better at, in thinking of democracy as a process that transforms us as citizens, in thinking of democracy as a process that helps us to achieve the goals that you may have been thinking about when thinking about the purpose that brought you here to this conference. When thinking in those terms, I like to think of democracy as being like love. Bell Hooks is a famous feminist author. Bell Hooks talks of love not as being like a thing or a condition, like you fall in love, like you fall in a ditch or fall ill. She talks about democracy as love. She doesn't talk about democracy as love. She talks about love as a verb, love as a thing you do, love as a practice. And she defines it as the extension of yourself, the practical, ongoing, day-to-day extension of yourself to support the growth of another. Democracy, then, I would say, is like love in the sense that it's a practice. It's a thing that we do. It's a thing we could do in lots of different ways. And it is most fundamentally about helping us to bridge from selfish, more narrowly concerned people to people who find ourselves in common cause and in community with one another and ready to support collective action over a long period of time that can help to address the challenges of our times. So, I want to thank you very much for your attention. It's been a very long weekend. I'm extremely tired, and I feel like I've meandered a little bit at a few points. But democracy is love, and let's love each other really well. Thank you.